So thank you very much for the invite to come and deliver this talk. My work, really going right back to my undergraduate days, has been looking at prosopagnosia and particularly the developmental form of the condition. Now, I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with the condition prosopagnosia, but to give you a quick introduction, it's basically a failure to recognise familiar faces. So people with prosopagnosia have real difficulties recognising the faces of others. And in the literature, what you tend to see is two very broad subtypes. And I've kind of illustrated these here. We have people who have acquired prosopagnosia. So these are people who previously had normal face recognition abilities, and they then experienced neurological trauma or neurological injury, and as a result, they actually lost their face processing skills. Now this can happen at any stage of development, even in the womb or during birth. So anywhere where a neurological insult has happened, we tend to refer to those people as acquired prosopagnosics. So, as I've illustrated there, it can happen in adulthood or in childhood. Now, much more commonly, and what we have seen in the literature, particularly over the last decade or so, is increasing reports of people who have developmental prosopagnosia. Now, it's somewhat of a tricky issue as you look through the literature to really work out who people are referring to when they talk about developmental prosopagnosics, because different authors actually use the term quite interchangeably. Now, some people will call acquired prosopagnosics who received their injury very early on in development as developmental prosopagnosics. When I use the term developmental prosopagnosics, I'm not referring to that category of people. Okay, so some authors do still do that. Others include people who have face recognition difficulties as a result of other conditions. So this might be alongside autism, other socio-emotional disorders. Particularly in autism spectrum disorders, you do tend to see face processing difficulties. There's been some work that's suggested that while face recognition skills are significantly worse than match controls in autism, they aren't necessarily as severe as what you see in prosopagnosia. Okay, and again, what we do with our group is we partial out those people from our sample, so we don't include anyone who had a brain injury or who seems to have an accompanying socio-emotional disorder. So it's these two groups here what I'm particularly interested in, and I've kind of made this term up that I've referred to as pure developmental prosopagnosia, basically to illustrate the fact that we do kind of keep our sample as pure as we can. Now, again, we have some issues with terminology in the literature, and we see some authors actually refer to this group as congenital prosopagnosics or hereditary prosopagnosics. And the reason for this is some developmental prosopagnosics do seem to have a genetic contribution to their disorder. So other family members also seem to have face processing difficulties as well. This is by no means all developmental prosopagnosics. Okay, so what we tend to do at the moment is kind of lump these two together into one group, irrespective of whether or not there's a seemingly genetic contribution. And this is the group I'm focusing on today. So, to give you a little bit more of an overview of what I'm going to refer to as developmental prosopagnosia for the rest of my talk, and I've actually will abbreviate this to DP, if you're wondering what that means on my slides. We do currently see what these congenital and these developmental prosopagnosics as one group, and there's been a couple of studies that actually have looked at the incidence rate of this disorder, and they've come back with a rate of 2%, which is actually pretty high. That's 1 in 50 people. So very strikingly high for a disorder that really receives quite little attention. What you tend to see with developmental prosopagnosics is often a host of other problems. Okay, so it's not just a problem with face recognition. And often they have difficulties in navigation. We tend to see that in about 2/3 of the people that we meet. They have difficulties with left and right, particularly linked to their navigational difficulties. Some of them have problems with object processing as well, so it's not always just a pure face processing issue. And very frequently with other aspects of face perception, so that might be judging age or gender in faces. Now, there's some debate as to whether we're really looking at parallel disorders here when we're talking about our developmental prosopagnosia group. is this really a developmental equivalent to acquired prosopagnosia? And we do see some similarities, which are quite important theoretically. There are cases of developmental prosopagnosia where only face recognition is affected. So this is particularly important for the expertise debate that I'm sure many of you are aware of. We also tend to see two quite broad subtypes in developmental prosopagnosia, which kind of map on pretty well to what we see in acquired prosopagnosia. And this is the kind of hypothesis that you get, very broadly speaking, two types of patient, if you like. You have those who have difficulties in face perception. So this is how they're actually looking at faces. Okay, and they've been referred to as the apperceptive subtype. And then you have people with more of an associative subtype who are absolutely fine with face perception. They're looking at faces in quite a normal manner, but their impairment actually seems to be higher order. Okay, so it might be around the area of semantics or higher up in memory. Now that dissociation's been shown fairly well over the years with acquired prosopagnosia, and I think we can say that we tend to see quite a similar pattern with our developmentals. But the important point to realise with these developmental prosopagnosics is each person is different, so we don't see a kind of specific set of cognitive symptoms that come along with each individual person. They all have a problem in recognising faces, but there are a host of other difficulties, some of which I've mentioned, which are sometimes impaired and sometimes not, and in various combinations. So I just want to touch on this very, very quickly because it always tends to come up when I give talks, and that is how do we actually diagnose, if you like, developmental prosopagnosia. And I don't really want to kind of make the case that I go around diagnosing people and giving them labels as a condition, but we do need to pre-screen these people when they come to see us, just to make sure that they do meet the criteria for taking part in the research and therefore testing the hypotheses that we are actually testing. What we tend to do is carry out two actual face recognition tests with all these prosopagnosics. We carry out the Famous Faces test, and this is a standardised Famous Faces test which is used across most labs in the world at the moment. There are different ones for different countries with different sets of control data that go with those. The main other face recognition test we use is called the Cambridge Face Memory Test, which I'm sure some people are familiar with. And this is a test created in Brighter Shane's lab, which is kind of a face learning test. Okay, and it places various demands on participants and gets progressively harder for them to actually recall a set of encoded faces. So to diagnose, if you like, prosopagnosia, we need to see impairments of both of those tests. Most importantly as well, the person needs to think they actually have prosopagnosia. They need to report difficulties in their everyday life. So what we do is we don't go out there just screening anybody and saying, right, you achieved a low score, therefore you are prosopagnosic. So it's quite important we get that subjective as well as that objective report. We also pre-screen them for any visual problems, and we tend to use the Birmingham Object Recognition Battery for that, just to check there's nothing odd in their very basic lower level vision. It may be they have difficulties with objects, it may be they don't. That's not integral to the actual diagnosis, if you like. And as I've already said, we use, the Cambridge Face Perception Test is actually a test of actual face perception, and again, they may have difficulties or they may not, but that doesn't exclude them from receiving that diagnosis. So, what actually causes developmental prosopagnosia then? Well, the jury's out there basically. There have been a number of hypotheses out there in the literature. Various things have been kind of tested, and various haven't. We know that these people have never experienced a brain injury, and we know that their basic intellectual and their very basic visual processes are absolutely fine. So we can rule out any of those causes. What has been tested so far is this hypothesis is genetic. Well, okay, in some cases maybe it does seem to be the case, but certainly not in all. Okay, and I should add that no gene has actually been found there. Perhaps it accompanies socio-emotional difficulties, and that hypothesis has actually been fairly well refuted because there's been a number of cases reported where there are no accompanying social problems. Maybe it results from early visual deprivation. And this is quite an interesting one because very often when I'm interviewing prosopagnosics, they do say that they had quite an unusual period of vision in their early development. So it might have been they needed glasses for a few years, but they never received them. And that kind of trend in reporting is something we're actually seeing very frequently. And it kind of overlaps quite nicely with the infantile cataract literature. Some of you may be aware of this, where children or babies who are actually born with congenital cataracts and have them removed very early in development actually never go on to develop normal face recognition skills. So it may be there's something in that particular hypothesis. Perhaps it's underpinned by deficit in configurable processing. There's been just a few papers out there that do suggest that we see these deficits in these people. Maybe it results in neurological abnormalities. Again, there have been a couple of studies out there that have looked at this. And what they've shown is, in some cases, a smaller temporal lobe or particularly a fusiform face region. But in others, it's been completely normal. And then the final hypothesis is maybe it's none of the above. Maybe we're just looking at a group of people who are just the wrong end of normal, if you like. Maybe we've just picked up on something that some people are bad at. There's a continuum of normal face processing ability. And perhaps that's what these people are. Maybe they're not doing anything qualitatively different to the rest of us, they're just poorer at it. Now, one way to actually investigate that is to look at eye movement strategy. Okay, so how are these people actually processing faces? Are they actually doing something completely different to normal people or typical people? And this has actually received very, very little attention in the literature. There's some stuff out there for acquired prosopagnosia, probably less than 10 papers. But before I started this particular body of work, there was only one paper out there so far for developmental prosopagnosia. And this paper was by Schwarzer et al. 2007. And what these authors actually did was they just showed a group of developmental prosopagnosics, a set of famous faces, and they just measured the length of dwell time that was spent looking at those inner features, so the eyes, the nose and the mouth together, and the length of time they spent looking at the external features, so basically what's left of the face. And they found that the developmental prosopagnosics spent less time looking at the inner features. What does that tell you? Well, the authors claim maybe the external features are more informative. Well, yes, probably they are to the prosopagnosics. Maybe it's better for them to look at the hair for face recognition. But it doesn't really get to grips with what's going on with this processing strategy. I don't think it really tells you very much. And eye movement analysis actually gives you the ability to look a lot more in depth at processing strategy than just to take this very kind of blunt measure, how much are you looking at those inner features of the face. And these are actually very theoretically relevant measures as well. So not only can they inform us about the nature of scanning in prosopagnosia, they can actually tell us about some key debates in the face processing literature. Now, there's two particular types of analyses that can be performed on eye movement data for faces. And what I'm going to do is present a study that speaks to each of those two in turn. First of all, we can look at how people actually extract information from a face. Okay? And by that, I mean the use of more fixation-based measures. How many fixations per second? How many regions of the face are sampled? What's that actual scanning strategy? In typical viewers, we actually see that these measures vary according to face familiarity. So we actually see a different scanning strategy, a different type of information extraction for familiar faces than we do to novel faces. And this is really important because it can actually tell us about the nature of these internal face representations in prosopagnosia, or indeed, if they actually have any internal face representations. So will they still show these two different styles of scanning for different types of face? Now, the other type of analyses you can look at is actually to look at the different facial features, and you can look at how long people spend studying different features. So you can look at how long someone spends on the eyes and the mouth and so on. Now, the critical comparison which people have done before is very much focused on the eye versus the mouth. These are thought to be two very key features. And in typical viewers, what you actually see is these particular measures actually vary according to facial expression. So they don't really do much when you're looking at face familiarity, but they do tend to go show different trends for facial expression. And this can tell us about First of all, do prosopagnosics avoid or overly focus on certain features? And if they do, are those effects actually absolute or are they changeable? So I'm going to present you first of all an initial experiment talking about these more fixation-based scanning measures, and then move on to a second one, looking at the dwell time spent on specific features. Now, I'm going back a couple of years, well, probably a few years now, with my work on this, which has been kind of an ongoing strand of my research. And these, this particular differences in familiar versus novel faces stems back to an effect reported by Althoff and Cohen in 1999, which they termed the eye movement-based memory effect. And this basically refers to the phenomenon that in typical viewers, you tend to see a reduction in information extraction for familiar faces compared to novel faces, a face reprocessing effect, if you like. And what the authors basically suggested with this is when we see a novel face, and this has been stretched a little bit, so sorry, this man's face looks absolutely huge on here. When you place a novel face in front of someone, the idea is maybe a general schema just is initiated, and what you tend to do is make a triangular scanning sequence between the eyes, the nose and the mouth. And this happens because there's nothing else to guide your scanning. Okay, you've got no existing face representations to guide your scanning of this face. So what you get is a very predictable scanning sequence. Now, when you look at familiar faces, what tends to happen is within the first fixation or so, a hypothesis is probably generated. Okay, so this may be Tony Blair or Margaret Thatcher. Once that hypothesis is generated, it's likely that will guide you or guide the location of your next fixation to actually test that hypothesis. So it might be that person has a big nose, so the fixation would then be directed to the nose. It might be they have a very distinctive chin, and so on. So what you tend to get for familiar faces is a much less predictable scanning sequence. And the idea is also that with familiar faces, because you have processed that face on previous occasions, your scanning will reflect this, and you'll see less information extraction in order to actually make your decision on whether or not that face is familiar and who it is. Now, Althoff and Cohen used a number of fixations, which I've listed here. Fixation rate, they actually used a number of fixations, okay, and for my work I actually changed this to a fixation rate because we don't want it to be reliant on a reaction time period, if you like. We want this measure to be dependent on reaction time. The number of regions sampled, so they basically divided their face into right eye, left eye, nose, mouth and other, okay, and they looked at the number of those regions, so out of a possible 5 that were sampled. The number of regionally repetitive fixations, so this is how many fixations, once you've entered one particular region, you then get a second and a third and so on fixations within that same region before moving on. And the idea behind that is if you need to further sample that particular region, it may be it's because that region may be particularly ambiguous, okay, and you need to carry on testing your hypothesis or gaining more information from that particular region. Dwell time on inner features, okay, so this was another one that they looked at, so this is this kind of I think it's quite an odd measure, this inner features, and I think what we see in the eye tracking literature actually contradicts what we see in the behavioural face processing literature, because what Althoff and Cohen found was you actually spend less time on these inner features for familiar faces. Now, in the face processing literature, we actually see the opposite. People tend to rely on those inner features more when they recognise familiar faces than when they see novel faces. We actually replicated the effect that Althoff and Cohen found, and my interpretation of this is if we're to believe this theory about this general schema and the predictability of scanning, it might be that a fixation is required to fall outside of that inner that inner region, if that's where you need to look to actually confirm who that person is. It's one hypothesis. What Althoff and Cohen also did was they looked at the predictability and order of scanning. So they used things like Markov transition matrices to look at where people will look after they've looked at a certain feature. So if I was to look at the this particular eye here, the right eye first, what's the likelihood I would next look at the nose, or what's the probability I would next move to the mouth? So this is testing this hypothesis that you get a much more predictable order of scanning for novel faces than what you do for famous faces. Now, I tried this on several occasions and I just couldn't replicate the effect. I don't know if it was because my work was mostly using older adults because we'd actually age matched our controls to our prosopagnosia participant, and Althoff and Cohen used undergraduate participants. But we simply couldn't replicate those findings. So for the data I'm going to present now, I'm actually just going to leave those particular measures out of the equation. Now, not only is using the eye movement-based memory effect rather useful for giving us insight into what might be impaired in terms of scanning strategy in prosopagnosia, but it's also got some quite important theoretical implications. It can tell us about covert or unconscious recognition in developmental prosopagnosia, and indeed whether or not this is possible. Now, there have been a couple of previous reports in the eye movement literature where the eye movement-based memory effect has been used to illustrate covert recognition, and this came from the amnesia literature. So we had Ryan et al. In 2000, and they actually used familiar and repeated scenes rather than faces. And in a single amnesia patient, they actually found a reduction in information sampling for the repeated compared to the novel scenes. Likewise, Althoff 1999, they actually used faces, and they found the eye movement-based memory effect for learned compared to novel faces in 7 of their patients with amnesia. So there's some support to suggest that maybe this is a fruitful line of research. However, even if this particular methodology or this particular effect might be able to detect covert recognition in some patients or some neurological patients, is it actually theoretically possible to observe covert recognition in developmental prosopagnosia? And this is something that rather stumped me, because when I look back to the literature, you actually don't find any evidence of this in developmental prosopagnosics. And the reason for this is, according to the authors who reported these failures to actually provide this evidence, is that to observe covert recognition, the patient must actually have had a normal period of face recognition where they lay down in memory face representations. So in acquired prosopagnosics, this isn't a problem. They would have had a normal period of face recognition prior to their accident or their illness. And it might be during that period, of course, they would have laid down their face representations. The neurological damage might make those representations slightly damaged or inaccessible, but nevertheless, we can still pick up covert recognition. Now, 2 studies had actually attempted in the 1990s to find evidence of covert recognition in developmental prosopagnosics, and they had failed, and this was the reason that they actually put forward. However, when you look in more depth at these 2 studies, it's maybe not so surprising that they failed to observe covert recognition. Both the cases actually had perceptual impairments. Now, if you think back to earlier on, when I first started talking about developmental prosopagnosia, we see these 2 different subtypes. The apperceptive ones, who have problems in face perception, how they look at faces, and the more associative ones. And what the literature has told us so far is that with cases of acquired prosopagnosia, you tend to only see covert recognition in those who have more of the associative subtype. So if there's perceptual difficulties, you're actually quite unlikely to be able to observe covert recognition in your cases. Now, a later study actually did find some evidence of covert recognition in developmental prosopagnosia, but using the skin conductance response. Now, that's a physiological measure of covert recognition, so it's quite different to these behavioural measures of which the eye movement-based memory effect would tend to fall into. So we could perhaps have a refined hypothesis where we say, well, maybe you can't actually observe covert recognition on a behavioural scale in developmental prosopagnosia. But nobody had actually looked at this using a suitable case. They're using more of an associative subtype, if you like. So if we do observe evidence of the eye movement-based memory effect here, it would be the first evidence of behavioural covert recognition in the condition. So this is what we did. Back at this time, I actually had access to only one case of prosopagnosia, one developmental case. So this is a single case study. We used case AA, as we called him. He was 57 years old at the time we tested him. He was an extremely intelligent man, educated to degree level, and he was then working as an Open University lecturer. He previously taught physics in a secondary school that had to leave when the pupils caught on to his face recognition difficulties, and he was given rather a hard time at work. So he moved on to the Open University, where he could actually carry out most of his work from home and behind the internet. We checked his brain on an MRI scan, and we found no abnormalities, and he reported no history of any neurological illness, lower level vision intact, and he actually had no problems whatsoever with objects. He was severely impaired at face recognition, so very poor scores on both the Cambridge Face Memory Test and Famous Faces. Most importantly, and the point I need to highlight here, is his score on the Cambridge Face Perception Test was okay. He didn't have any face perception problems, so he would fall more into this kind of associative category that I've been talking about. So if we're going to see covert recognition, importantly, he must fit that criteria. So he was the ideal case to actually be exploring this issue with. We matched 10 controls to him according to age, 5 of those were male, and we also matched that according to estimated IQ. Right, so it was a very simple study. We had 100 faces, all with neutral expressions, 50 of which were famous, and 50 of which were novel. The famous faces were actually chosen on the basis of an initial pilot study where we just checked which faces would be very familiar to that particular age group. Okay? And then the novel faces, we actually had somebody who wasn't one of the experimenters match a face to each of the famous ones. So it wasn't just according to gender and age, it was kind of looking at the perceptual characteristics of each image as well. Otherwise you kind of get someone who's very obviously a politician, even though you try and kind of crop everything out. So we made sure everything was very well matched. Participants just basically sat in front of the eye tracker. They saw each face individually for 5 seconds per face in a random order. We had one continuous block with only initial calibration. And we asked them to actually make a familiarity judgment by a key press on a joypad in front of them to signify whether they thought that face was familiar or novel. After the eye tracking test, we actually showed them the famous faces again, and we asked them to actually name each face or provide us with some uniquely identifying information about them, and also to rate them according to familiarity. We also provided them with the name cues if they couldn't work out who that person was, and then we excluded anyone who they just simply wouldn't have expected to recognise or who they rated as very low in familiarity from our analyses. We used the same interest areas as Outhoff and Cohen, so the 2 eyes, the nose and the mouth. And I'll display this data graphically in just a second, but just to give you an overview of what the controls did. Unsurprisingly, they had very high accuracy. Okay, they made very few errors, it was a very easy task. We did find a difference on reaction times for famous compared to novel faces, and that was significant for the control participants. So they were much quicker at deciding whether a famous face was famous than they were a novel face was novel. And we also had an eye movement-based memory effect on all measures. So for the famous faces, we found a lower rate of fixation, fewer regions sampled, fewer regionally repetitive fixations, and less time on the inner features. When it came to AA, surprisingly, he actually didn't do too bad on recognising the faces. He got 22 of the 50 famous faces actually correct. He did say afterwards he used the hair cues, because we did include the whole of the face in the images, and he had become very good at doing that as a compensatory strategy. He was highly familiar with every single one of the celebrities from the name cues, so we didn't remove any of those from the analyses in his case. And to make sure we actually going to provide evidence of covert recognition, we actually subdivided his famous faces into those he did explicitly recognise, given he recognised 44%, those that he failed to recognise, and novel faces. I won't present the data for reaction time. His reaction times were significantly slower than controls, unsurprisingly, but he did still show that increased, more rapid reaction time for famous compared to novel faces. And this is what the data look like. So what you can see here, the very light grey bar is your control data. So the 4 graphs, we have fixation rate, region count, regionally repetitive fixations, and proportion inner. The kind of medium grey bar is those famous faces that AA did recognise, and the black bar is those that he failed to recognise. Now, we didn't find a difference on fixation rate for AA. He didn't show any difference between famous and novel faces, but his fixation rate wasn't significantly different to controls either, so he just wasn't showing the effect rather than doing anything strikingly different to controls. Region count, quite clearly, we had significant differences for both his recognised and not recognised famous faces compared to novel. Same for regionally repetitive fixations, and same for the proportion inner. When you look at his scanning strategy, it's actually remarkably similar to controls. He's not doing anything hugely different, except just here on this proportion inner. And there he had, and it was only for novel faces. He actually spent much less time on the inner features of novel faces than controls did. Sorry, more time. I'm getting so confused there. So that was one particular set of findings for this. So in that data, what we actually see is we have provided some evidence of behavioural covert recognition in developmental prosopagnosia. And when we went on to publish this, we just about got in there with being the first reported finding in the literature, but it was quite quickly followed up by another paper by Avedon and Berman in 2008, and they actually used 6 patients who used different behavioural indicators. They didn't use eye movements, so these were kind of behavioural priming measures and simple reaction time measures. We later replicated the finding in 3 additional developmental prosopagnosics using a face learning paradigm, and I won't actually present that data today for time reasons. So what can we conclude? Well, it's clear from this data at least, perhaps you don't need a period of normal face recognition to observe covert recognition in prosopagnosia. So how might we explain what we've seen here? Well, maybe developmental prosopagnosics can still lay down at least partially intact face representations. And there's been some suggestion or some hypothesis that perhaps each time prosopagnosics see a face, they can encode a different part of that face. Okay, and they can add it to their internal face representation. Those face representations may not, and obviously can't support full overt recognition, but may be enough so that you can observe covert recognition in these individuals. And this is supported by this finding that eye movements are differing for these different types of faces. Okay, and this must be guided, at least to some extent, by internal established face representations. Okay, so I'll speed up a little bit here because I'm conscious of time. So on the whole, I think what we've shown here is not any huge differences in scanning strategy between a prosopagnosic case and controls. And we've more or less seen this expected trend for familiar versus novel faces. We did fail to find the eye movement-based memory effect for fixation rate in our case AA. Hard to actually pinpoint what might be going on there. It may be he actually has a slightly slower speed of scanning due to his prosopagnosia, but it wasn't significantly slower than controls. We saw the problem with the inner features. Okay, so this kind of cued me to move on to the next experiment, which was maybe it's not.
So he reported that he used a strategy of looking at the hair, right? But you seem to only find that in the eye movement data for the novel phases. That's a bit surprising.
Yeah, it's really hard to explain.
Yeah.
One of the things about this inner feature thing, which I don't know if it's really telling us what they're doing, because essentially what you're doing in these experiments is you're just sticking a face in front of a person with prosopagnosia. They've got nowhere else to look apart from that face, so it's not anywhere near like what they do in real life. And I'm going to talk a bit more about some more ecologically valid stimuli that we're currently using at the moment. So I don't like the inner features measure, and I don't, at least in the way it's been used so far, and I can't explain the different patterns of findings other than, I don't know, I I do think you're just sticking a face in front of somebody where they can look. Maybe sometimes it's at the hair. And I think it also depends on the task, because if you've got a face recognition task, maybe it makes more sense for them to look at the hair, and they're trying to code the hair. Okay, because in these eye movement measure experiments, people don't tend to cut out the external features. If they're looking at that face under free view conditions, they might not necessarily go out to the inner features so much, because they don't need to hang on to something that's so much encoding. So I'm with you on that one, but I can't really explain it. And as I guess this is really my last point here, is that measure does remain unclear, despite being very widely used with a huge number of disorders. So you look in the literature and you kind of see something odd about proportion dwell time to inner features for schizophrenia, for autism, for OCD, lots of different types of disorders. And this is what I really wanted to tap into with my next study. So this is looking at the second one, differences in actual patterns of feature exploration. Okay. Now, these particular measures have been shown, so I'm talking about here how long we spend looking at the eyes, the nose and the mouth. These tend to vary much more with different facial expressions than they do with faces of different familiarity. So this was kind of the rationale for the current study, was to manipulate this according to facial expression rather than familiarity. Now if I kind of backtrack somewhat and just talk a little bit about the eye tracking literature with acquired prosopagnosia. What you tend to see in these studies, and there's probably about 10-ish, maybe slightly less papers out there, is most of those 10 papers have just used this measure, the inner features. Do they look at the inner features more or less than controls? A couple of them have actually looked at actual fixation to the facial features themselves, so they've gone in there in more depth. Okay, so they've not just lumped them together into one measure. And what we've seen in a couple of these papers is in acquired prosopagnosia, we see reduced fixation on the eye. And in one of those papers, that we actually saw, as a result, increased fixation on the mouth. Now, very little work, as I've already said, has examined any of these measures in developmental prosopagnosia. There was the Schwarzer paper from 2007 that just reported this reduced fixation on the inner features. What our work in the previous studies had shown was, yes, you do get reduced fixation on the inner features, but we only found that from novel faces. What might this particular measure then represent? Well, if you actually talk to the prosopagnosics and you ask them what they think might be going on, they tell you that perhaps they're doing it on a voluntary basis. They don't like faces, and they certainly don't like eyes. So they actually find it quite intimidating. So if you put yourself in their shoes and you're looking at somebody for an extended amount of time, just working out who they are, that's a very socially unacceptable thing to do, is to simply stand there and stare at somebody in the face or in the eyes. They also will tell you external features are actually just more useful. I can recognise people much better if I use their hair, their ear shape, their jawline, and so on. It could be it's involuntary avoidance of eyes and faces, so some attentional mechanism is impaired. Or it could be it's a very much more specific deficit in actual face processing strategy. And what this particular measure doesn't do is tell us anything about any of those things. Now, manipulating emotional expression actually provides quite, what I hope, quite a nice way to investigate what's going on with feature exploration in prosopagnosia. And that's because there's a key finding out there in the literature that's been shown a couple of times, where people tend to look more at the eye region for sad faces and more towards the mouth for happy faces. Okay, and you have your neutral baseline there in the middle. So what we could actually do is investigate whether we find this trend in our developmental prosopagnosics. If they actually have a specific problem, say with the eye region, they might not be pulled or orient towards the eyes when they're cued to do so, so when they see a sad face. Okay, so that might not happen. And this is exactly what we set out to investigate. Now, this time we actually had 9 prosopagnosics prosopagnosic participants. So this was a little later on, when we kind of recruited a much bigger group. 5 of them were male. Again, this is an older adult sample. Our mean age was 54.6 years, about 55 years. IQ was fairly high, average of 119. But what we actually did with these individuals was we only selected those who had normal facial expression recognition skills. Okay, so some prosopagnosics, as I've already said, actually had deficits in expression recognition, but for the purposes of this study, we wanted those with normal expression skills. We used 18 controls and matched 2 to each prosopagnosic according to age, gender and IQ. Again, it was a very simple design, but this time we used free view. We had 48 faces, and they displayed either happy, sad or neutral expressions. We used the same identity for each expression, so there was, for example, this lady here, you would see her with each of the expressions. And that was just to make sure identity didn't interfere with any of the effects. We used half males, half females for the faces, and we actually used exactly the same database as used by Eisenbarth and Alpers, who reported the first kind of effect of this increased fixation to the eyes for sad faces and to the mouth for happy faces. We kept the external features present, okay, because this is actually part of what we're looking at. They just free viewed each face individually for 5 seconds each in a random order, again single block, okay, and then an initial calibration. And when it came to the analysis here, I carried out 2 specific measures. First of all, I did just look at the dwell time on the inner features. I just wanted to see what was going on with that particular measure. So the interest areas look something like that. Okay, so it covers both eyes, the nose and the mouth. To look in more detail at attention towards the eyes and the mouth, I actually calculated what's called an eye-mouth dominance ratio. And the reason to do this is to actually take account, proportionately speaking, that probably the prosopagnosic groups would look less at the inner features than the controls. So it's therefore necessary to calculate attention to the eyes and the mouth as a proportion of the time they actually spend on those inner features. What you then get is a value, okay, and those higher values indicate more time on the eyes, and those lower values indicate more time towards the mouth. And here's the data. So first of all, looking at the inner features measure. What I will say before is I did, as a check, just calculate overall trial dwell time and attention to background, and there was no between group differences. So it was, any of these effects weren't due to the prosopagnosics looking off the face, if you like. So what we get here is orange bars are our DP group, our prosopagnosic group. The blue bars are the controls. You can straight away see a very obvious main effect. The prosopagnosics are looking less at the inner features than the controls. What we saw, first of all, in the control participants is basically increased fixation towards the inner features for emotive faces compared to neutral. So it didn't matter if they were happy or sad, they were actually just drawn more towards the inner features than they were for neutral faces. But for our prosopagnosic participants, we actually only saw that effect for happy faces and not for sad faces. Okay, so they're only increasing their fixation to the inner features when they see a happy face. Now, onto the eye-mouth dominance ratio findings. What you can see, again, we have our controls in the blue. So this is our neutral, oh, sorry, I've done that again. That's our neutral baseline there in the middle. You can see there's a significant dip towards the mouth of happy faces for controls, and a significant increase towards the eyes of sad faces for controls. When it comes to our prosopagnosic group, with the orange line, we do see that dip towards the mouth, so they're looking more at the mouth for happy faces, but actually they don't show that increase in looking more towards the eyes for sad faces. So they're actually treating sad faces almost in the same way as they are as neutral faces. Now, what I wanted to further investigate here was, on a case-by-case basis, how many of those individual prosopagnosics actually showed that effect. And 7 out of the 9 actually significantly failed to orientate towards the eyes for those sad faces. So that effect was seen seen in 7 of the 9 individuals. So what have we seen here then? Well, the prosopagnosics definitely aren't looking at the inner features as much as controls, but this seems to be modifiable for happy faces. So when you cue them more towards the mouth, they're quite happy to do that, quite happy to look at the mouth more. But they don't do that for the eyes. So when they're cued to the eyes from sad faces, they're not showing that same effect. And what can we really conclude here? Well, actually, yes, there does seem to be quite a specific problem with the eye region. What I can't answer with this data is if that's voluntary or involuntary still. We can make some hypotheses and try to draw some inferences there. And I'm thinking of ways in which I might be able to further actually test that at the moment. There's one quite interesting possibility is the fact that if prosopagnosics aren't looking as much towards the eyes as they should do, this could actually interfere with configural processing. And I realise we've got some configural processing experts in the room here who may tell me completely different. A recent paper by Peterson and Eckstein in 2012 actually found an optimal viewing position for face perception using eye tracking data. And it's just here. So it's just below the eye region on the nose. And what these authors actually suggested was that maybe that's where typical viewers tend to look, because it's actually the optimal location to be able to take into account spatial relations between features. But it's also oriented towards that very important eye region, which not only tells you something about face identity, but also about how a person's feeling, and so on. There's work out there that says we actually process a face within 1 or 2 fixations, and it may be that's the optimal location for those initial fixations. So if prosopagnosics simply are pulled further down from here, maybe that's actually interfering with their face processing strategy. Now, an alternative explanation that I can't firmly rule out is maybe those prosopagnosics just had a problem with sad facial expressions. Okay, we did test this as thoroughly as we could using the Ekman 60 Faces test, the Reading the Mind in the Eyes test, and the Emotional Hexagon test. And we didn't find any expression deficits for any expressions in the 9 prosopagnosics that we used. So hopefully that's enough to refute that hypothesis, but of course that possibility is still there. Okay, so I just want to pull things together in the last bit of my talk. We haven't seen any abnormalities in what I've called general scanning strategy, so it doesn't seem there's too much different going on in these prosopagnosics in number of fixations, number of regions that they sample, etc. But we've got this clear avoidance of the eye region. So there's something about these kind of proportion dwell times to specific regions of the face. I made the case maybe this could disadvantage other aspects of face perception, and particularly impede configural processing. But we've still got these open questions that remain. Why are prosopagnosics avoiding the eyes? It could be it's as simple as social anxiety. One of the things I didn't do was actually collect social anxiety ratings from the prosopagnosics, and one way of looking at that is to actually correlate those with the eye movement findings. Another thought I had was, what happens if you actually just tell them to look at the eyes? Will their face recognition ability get somewhat better? What if you just point this out? And I know there was a report going back some time now where similar findings came up with a patient who had difficulties recognising emotional expression. And actually, as soon as he was directed just to look at the eyes, his expression ability improved. So something very simple we could try. And how do we actually investigate whether there's a link between these eye movement measures and configural processing? Again, can we correlate some findings on configural processing tests with the eye movement measures? But we just need to further our understanding of this inner features measure, and particularly, as we picked up before, are we using this measure appropriately? And I just wanted to flash some data up from a study that's ongoing at the moment. Now, I haven't carried out the overall analyses on these, and I have no idea if you'll be able to see this from how far back you are. What we did, or what we're doing in this current study, is we're actually using natural social scenes, and we're just using the free view paradigm again, and just popping them up in front of controls and our prosopagnosics. This is a control participant, And what you can basically see is he just flips between the eyes of each of the characters in the scene. Okay, he's just going I. Occasionally he's looking down, so they look. Oh, sorry, I keep on doing that. He's looking down here to see what the lady's holding in her hand, so something's just grabbed the attention there. You come over here to our. This is just one prosopagnosic participant. He's actually going mouth, mouth, nose, mouth, and it's actually quite striking. We've tested about 10 prosopagnosics so far, and I've only looked at the data, I've only eyeballed it, but the pattern does seem quite striking, and it will be interesting to see what the analyses actually show us. I think using eye movements in, with more ecologically valid stimuli such as this is actually going to be a lot more fruitful, because you're not doing this thing, as we were saying earlier, of just sticking a face in front of somebody where they've got nowhere else to look. So quite honestly, probably they're going to look at that face. But here, what we've got is groups of actors who aren't even looking at the participant, they're going about their own business. And it's one way we can actually look in a much more effective manner at, first of all, just attention to faces, and second, attention to specific features of faces. There's also some suggestions out there, and this is particularly in the autism literature, that you can actually detect aberrant scan patterns much more readily when you use more ecologically valid stimuli. So you're actually much more likely to see any difficulties, any impairments within a paradigm like this, rather than just using static and individual faces. So we'll see what this particular study brings about, but that was just some images I wanted to flash up. So I just wind up now with this particular slide. Where do I see all this going? Well, I actually quite like the use of eye movement technology. If we can develop these findings into a way where we can quite reliably use it almost as a detection or diagnostic tool for prosopagnosia. We have problems with using these standard face recognition tests with prosopagnosics because they come up with the most elaborate compensatory strategies where they can actually get a normal score. And, you know, I've had people say, oh, I just use the eyebrows, or I just use, you know, the chin, the jaw shape, whatever. And no matter how well you try and obscure that, you do get some who just achieve apparently normal scores using feature-by-feature strategies. So an alternative way is actually to look at strategy itself. Let's use eye movements to actually look at how they're processing faces rather than looking at their proportion correct scores. Particularly useful with young children. Okay, all the different demands on young children who haven't developed normal attentional and other cognitive abilities yet. Much more easier to use a very rapid eye movement test. Some of these only take a couple of minutes. Than to sit them in front of a 72 trial face recognition test, which you probably get an abnormal score on with a normal child anyway. It may be we can form some training techniques. So we might be able to actually gain some insights into what these people are doing differently, use that to inform training, and then actually use these eye movement tests to assess the success of training. And this is where I see these things going right now. So I should finish there. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
So at the moment you're using the free viewing paradigm. I've always had a thing about free viewing. You don't know what they're doing, but would it be an interesting one where you just actually ask them to look at faces and later they have to recognize them, but you circumvent the strategies by presenting the people from a slightly different angle where most of the strategies would work?
We do that anyway, and you still can find that they're quite successful at that. So we either change expression or we will actually choose change viewpoint. In the actual Cambridge test, the main diagnostic test, they actually add lots of noise as well as changing the viewpoint of the images, and they make them lighter or darker. These prosopagnosics still can get past that. So it's a difficult issue at the moment. It's the main test that's used worldwide, yet we do seem to, get people who swear they are absolutely terrible at face recognition. And you're testing them, they get a seemingly normal score on some of these tests, and you take them to the loo, and then they walk past you on the way out, not, recognizing. That's, so The reason we didn't do that so much here is because we're looking at the eye movements. It's actually quite a different thing to look at eye movements to a profile face than it is to a front-on face.
Yeah, you would still be able to look at like the regions, right?
Yeah, you
still
could.
code them.
Yeah, they would be significantly smaller, I guess,
Mm.
for some of them. But yeah, and that's something we haven't done is actually do that under eye movement conditions. So, yeah.
Sorry, I wondered in the second experiment whether if you asked them to categorise the emotional
We did, yeah, we did do that afterwards. No problem. It was actually an extremely easy task though, because we only used the 3 expressions and they're quite different. That's why we actually we used the Ekman faces, we used these different kind of away from the eye tracker tests of expression recognition. We didn't find any abnormalities, but Calder and Young back in 2005 raised this issue that actually expression and identity processing aren't comparable, and it's a much easier task to recognise facial expression than it is identity. So we have to just, I think, accept
But
we
so
tested that.
the recognition of the sad faces are very good, even if they weren't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there was no problems whatsoever. So,
What about if you use fear faces, because obviously eyes are more diagnostic?
well, we didn't use fearful faces for the eye tracking, but on the hexagon tests and the Ekman faces, there was no problems. So again, nothing there. So it's strange because it's not in, but maybe we're not adequately testing that expression recognition skills, because it is, I think it is a lot easier than identity recognition. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. It was sort of thought-provoking. I'm not sure it's a question, right? It's an observation. In the course of making it, I will offend almost everybody. I don't mean it in that way at all. But if you were to do the same sorts of experiments with, I don't know, individuals with autism, and just measure their eye movements, you would get the same data.
Yeah.
So you might say, then the eye movement patterns, because those individuals will recognise people. So the eye movement record actually is quite independent of the recognition deficit that they have. You know, if you just treat it as a kind of logic experiment. But of course that's a ridiculous thing to say. It's unlike that. Nevertheless, it is a bit of a problem. So the question is, what is it about what drives the eye movement behaviour that really leads to the recognition deficit?
This was something I actually been having a bit to think about recently, and I've been coming up with maybe an alternative paradigm that might be able to partial out autism versus developmental prosopagnosia using eye movement measures. Because this is actually quite a hot issue in the literature, is this idea that maybe the 2 disorders are one and the same thing. You've got prosopagnosics probably with social problems as a result of their face recognition impairments, or are those social problems actually causing prosopagnosia? So this is kind of an idea that's still swimming around at the moment. What about if we use these kind of more naturalistic scenes, and we could do this with a movie, okay? What about if one of the actors is directly interacting with the participant, if you like? What if they're actually looking at the participant, attempting to make eye contact, they're talking to them? Theoretically speaking, the participant, whether that's a child or an adult, would avoid making eye contact with that person because they would perhaps feel threatened. But a prosopagnosic child or participant shouldn't. So what if we could manipulate it around that? So we bring in eye contact, we take this kind of idea of ecologically valid stimuli to the max and kind of have much more of an interactive format here. So I was thinking about this in context of very young children, because we're working with 4-year-olds at the moment. So 4-year-olds, anyway, you're not going to get them to sit through many tests, but what about a very quick 1-minute movie clip where you've got a variety of conditions interspersed with each other? Some of them are making eye contact, some of them the actor might be actually looking down, doing something, some of them, they might be talking over the shoulder of the participant, so not actually making eye contact with that person. And I wonder if we see some of these effects in some conditions, but actually be able to partial out the two groups in another.
So, it's an interesting thought. I actually don't know how that will pan out. For me, what's the bigger concern? So it's not so much concern with your it's manifest here, it's a much more general problem. Is that in the end the eye movements are a record of behaviour, right? But in some way they explain nothing other than give you a record of the behaviour. It's the first point where I offend 90% of the audience. In this particular case, given the observation around autism, maybe it's the case that people who have information processing systems that don't work efficiently have to compromise. And the easiest compromise to make is to not look at the very thing that's the most complicated thing to look at in the image. In other words, the response to the problem is to not look at the eyes. Whatever the problem could be a manifest, a large number. But the response is always the same. So I can't discriminate the different conditions on the basis of the behavioural response, but it tells me that there is some problem.
Yeah.
For us, that's then brings another difficulty, I think, which is that you rightly, I think, critique the inner versus outer, whatever you call that paradigm. Fundamentally, the models that we work with are so poor relative to some idea of what a perfect model would look like, that they're always, there's too much of a compromise, actually. That in reality, what probably is happening is there is an attempt at a template match of some type, and you stop seeking information once you've got that match to a template. And there are different things, different parts of the face which are differentially informative to that match. But that we don't have a good handle on how information is sampled to allow that match, if you like, the rate at which that match can happen, the threshold above which we think a match has or hasn't happened, all that sort of stuff. And until we have that, actually, to explore anything becomes really difficult. So the challenge is really to get a viable model of face processing, in its most simple form, even. So that's my second point, which I found everyone, including ourselves, in the sense that there are two problems which you're sort of illustrating really very well. So it's more an observation than a question, I suppose. So I don't know if there's something to say about it.
Yeah. I think you're right about the face processing models, and I think particularly about the disorders, and this was the point I was saying earlier about this inner features measure. Whatever disorder you can think of, you can pop it into a Scottish search, and you will find that disorder avoids the inner features of the face, whether that's for expression or identity. I think this eye movement-based memory effect gives us some sort of a starting point in looking at these face representations, but I do take the point that we're not obviously fully aware by any means of what we actually use for face recognition.
Would thinking about it for a minute, would one approach be not to classify them by disorder initially, but by the behavioural manifestation of their sample?
Yeah, and then do kind of like a huge, I don't know what you're doing,
sort of
analysis type. Yeah, I think so. I mean, this is kind of been the idea behind what we're doing with the prosopagnosis at the moment. We're trying to literally get as many as we can through on doing these initial screening tests, and then we move them on to the eye movement measures. And the rationale behind that is actually to look for different subtypes, because, yes, we're using this kind of perceptive associative idea that's been around for years, but probably there's multiple subtypes. It's not going to be as simple as one versus the other, and that linked to covert recognition. So that is one thing that we are doing at the moment, is taking that kind of approach within developmental prosopagnosia. It would be nice if you could almost even weed out the congenitals versus the developmentals even, but it's probably not going to be that simple by any means. But yes, you could do that across disorders. And I was talking to Debbie Roby last week actually, and she's been doing work with Williams syndrome using very similar paradigms, and they actually look more at the eyes. You kind of get the reverse effect, and I think that's really interesting. We're talking about